Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining me for the Westport Museum's weekly Tuesday Treasure program. My name is Nicole Carpenter. I'm the Director of Programs and Education here at the museum. And tonight we're going to be looking through some of the highlights of our collection that are not usually seen during an exhibition or by the public in general. As always, we offer this program and all of our other programs for free, but we do, of course, appreciate your continued support and do ask that you support us however you can. We do have a suggested donation of $5 for these programs, but we understand that this is a difficult time and ask that you support us however you can. One of those ways is also supporting us and following us on social media. You can always follow us and give us a like on Facebook and Twitter at Westport Museum and on Instagram at Westport History Museum. If you have any questions during our program, please feel free to enter them in the comment bar. I will go through these as much as I can at the end of our program. Feel free to put questions, little anecdotes, and I will go through them as much as I can at the end. So tonight we are titled Era of the Machine, and that means that we are going to go through some of the factories and industries, manufacturing companies that were here in Westport, as well as some of the products that were manufactured here or made here in Westport. Mostly we will focus on factories and manufacturing during the late 19th century and early 20th century, but there has always been industry in Westport, there's always been innovation, and we are only going to go through a few of them. I will mention some products very quickly at the end that we won't go into in too much detail, but always feel free to comment if you know of other products that were made or other companies that were operating out of Westport. We always love to hear information that adds on to our programs. So some of the factories or companies, industries that we're going to look at tonight were centered on, or actually based off of, the Saugatuck River. We know that the river brought in a lot of companies for the power that the river provided, and also for the convenience of transportation. It was very popular early on in colonial Connecticut to use the river as a way of transporting people and goods, and that continued on in the later centuries in the 19th and 20th, as I was saying. A lot of these companies, again, I think almost all of the companies, or all of the companies we're looking at this evening, were owned by men, and they brought a lot of wealth to those men. Many of them went on to be philanthropists and supported different Westport institutions. Many of their names appear on some buildings in town, which we'll get into a little bit. And to a certain extent, they did help create a wealthy Westport in that it brought wealth to these individuals, and through their philanthropy, they could create things to the benefit of their communities. But the workers in these factories were, for the most part, working long hours, 12 to 14-hour days, if not longer. And these workers included men and women. Most of them were immigrants. Some of the first immigrants that we see coming into Westport are the Irish during this time period. They actually come in with the introduction of the railroad in the mid-19th century. They create neighborhoods called Little Dublin, and later we see the Italians coming in as well and creating their own neighborhood of Little Italy. Later on in the centuries, we see waves of other European immigrants, Eastern Europeans, and that tradition continues today with immigrants coming in and filling positions in Westport in many different industries. It is important to note that children were also employed in some of these factories, and we're going to look at one that we do know for a fact employed children in their workforce. And oftentimes, not only were the workdays long, but the conditions could be dangerous. Many of these institutions used large manufacturing equipment. Others had harsh chemicals or other substances that could be dangerous. And many, unfortunately, used these chemicals in the runoff of their manufacturing process, they dealt with them by dumping them into the river, most likely. So there is a duality to these factories in that they brought jobs, and many of them, many of the operators and owners of these factories brought in wealth to their community, but it also was a very tough life to work in these factories, and it may have had environmental consequences as well. Without any further ado, I am going to put on one of my gloves, and we will get started on some of the actual objects. The first that I thought we would start with, and I will tip you down so that you can see our objects a little bit more clearly. These are very small, and you might not be able to see them extremely clearly, especially this one on our tablecloth, but these are buttons. Now, these buttons date from around 1860, and they are made of what is called ivory nut. And this is actually not ivory from an elephant, but from a Brazilian nut, from the shell. They would actually be ground down and polished into these buttons. And you can see on the back, they have a little hole that they could be thread through. And these were very typical of buttons that were used on textile, on clothing of the time, the mid to late 19th century. Now, these buttons were created by Alonzo and Jonathan Wheeler. They had a button shop factory, that was what it was called, along the Saugatuck River. Today, that site is roughly where the dock shop on the Saugatuck sits. These buttons, we know that this factory was using child labor. There is a photograph in our collection of children actually unloading materials from ships on the Saugatuck, again, using the river as transportation for their material, and children unloading barrels of these materials into the factory itself. Later on, this factory would be deeded to the Saugatuck Manufacturing Company, and that is what it's known throughout its history. And of course, this factory later on closes and becomes other sites. And again, today it is the dock shop. The next piece that I thought we would look at is a bit bigger. I'm going to have to lift you up a bit. This is a glass bottle. It might be a bit hard to read, but I will read it for you. This bottle most likely held formaldehyde. It does have a cork, but it is actually made of a hard substance, either stone or a ceramic top. And this container actually reads along the top here. It might be a bit hard to read, but it reads the Embalmers Supply Company and then Westport, Connecticut further down. On the other side of the bottle, it actually gives measurements in ounces. You might be able to see that a bit better. I'll show you the other side. Now, this bottle, again, was probably holding formaldehyde, and this was created by the Embalmers Supply Company, or ESCO. This company was originally founded in April of 1886 by C.B. Dolge and Max Hunke. They were both German-born. Dolge was an inventor, businessman, and an engraver, while Hunke was actually a practicing pharmacist, and they both lived in Brooklyn, where they founded what was originally called Dolge and Hunke, and came to be known as the Brooklyn Embalming Fluid Company, until 1890, when they moved their whole operation to Westport. They continued on for a few years before Dolge actually bought out Hunke in their business, and the business actually still is operating today. When they first started in the 1880s and continued on in the 1890s, they were creating embalming fluid in jars such as this, but it was not formaldehyde. Formaldehyde was not widely available. It was actually discovered in the 1880s. Their embalming fluid actually was based on a compound that included arsenic. Again, we talked about very briefly the environmental impact of dumping things like that into the Saugatuck River. Along with the embalming fluid, ESCO also created the instruments and accessories that embalmers needed. And they did this, one, to promote their products, but also to give their client everything that they needed to work on the practice that they were performing. Today, they no longer create the accessories and instruments that are needed to be used in embalming, and they are purely a chemical firm. It's also noteworthy, and you might see in a further episode of our Tuesday Treasures, the museum actually holds in our collections an embalming heater, an embalming fluid heater from ESCO as well that would be used during the embalming process. Dolge also created a school to teach embalming and also to use his products and his accessories in 1889, which he called the United States College of Embalming. It was later known, when it was owned by another individual, as the Renard Training School for Embalmers, and in 1954 it was absorbed by the American Academy McAllister Institute, where they still teach embalming today. And again, this company still exists, ESCO, in East Lyme, in Connecticut. The third artifact that I thought we would look at tonight is a scrap, actually. This is a scrap of leather. This would have been in a large, very large piece before it was actually punched with a leather punch, and this is the scrap that is left over after it has been shaped. Now this leather was actually produced at the Kemper Tannery, and the Kemper Tannery stood on Post Road. It was actually in an old barn that was originally built by R.H. Haight in between 1835 and 1837, so quite an old building. For a while, it was called the Morocco Manufacturing Company before it was owned by the Kemper family, who operated the tannery out of it. And leather was tanned in this company using sumac or chrome. It was also, unfortunately, part of the process included using human urine. So it was not a very pleasant place to work. It is notable that men and women were employed at the tannery, most of them immigrants, and there is evidence of children working there as well. There are some really wonderful photographs in our collection of men and women either in front of large vats working on actually tanning the leather on stretchers, or women actually processing the tanned leather into workable goods. Today, the Kemper Tannery is known as the Westport Country Playhouse. It reverted into the Playhouse in the mid-20th century, where it became, of course, this beloved Westport institution that it is today. Some of the other items that I thought I would show you tonight, really quickly, these are not produced, or were not produced at the ping pong ball factory, but there was a ping pong ball factory in Westport. It actually sat on Riverside Avenue, where Ridgeberry tankers are today. And I was told by one of our volunteers that she used to remember, actually one of our staff members, that she used to remember walking past the factory and being able to look in their basement windows where she could see the ping pong balls being made into pieces. And you can see ping pong ball such as this. It does have a seam here. They would create it in two halves, and then they would meld them together before launching them out. And this factory was owned by two brother-in-laws, Rogers and List. Another piece that I thought I would show you tonight is this piece. It is made of metal here, and it does have, it's a bit shiny, but it does have a maker's mark down here, And it says, I'll show you the piece that it goes on to. It includes its patent number, and then the Can Handle Company in Westport, Connecticut. So this piece actually hooks onto a can to create a very lovely little handle that you can use when drinking your beverage. And we have it on an antique Royal Crown Cola can here as well. One of the last pieces I thought we would look at is this here. This is a carburetor, and this was produced by the Tokay Motor Company. The Tokay name many Westporters will recognize from the Tokay Hall, which is the teen center, but the Tokay family actually built that originally to house the Tokay Opera Hall. But they actually gained their wealth through creating first cars. But they actually realized that these cars were much too expensive and were later beat out by the Model T with Ford. When they switched to creating just carburetors like this, which actually they produced for Ford cars, and also for boats. They became the Tokay Motor and Launch Company, I believe it was. So these small carburetors would have gone into Model Ts, but also boats. And if you look here, you can actually see the Tokay name. Beautiful. The last piece tonight is a very delicate piece. And this I do need my other glove on for. This is a label, and this is a label for a cotton felt mattress. The Wakeman Mattress Company, or the R. Wakeman and Son Company, they manufactured mattresses out of Saugatuck, and their factory, actually, the building still exists today, and it is where the Parker Mansion restaurant sits. And they created all kinds of different mattresses such as this, or that would have held a label such as this on them. And they have a really beautiful logo there in the middle with RW. There are, of course, many other companies and factories and inventors that lived in Westport. One of them was the Bainham Coffin Tack Factory, as well as the Dalton Knitting Machine Company, just to name two others. And there are, of course, many, many more in the history of Westport. So I hope you enjoyed looking at those pieces with me. We do have some comments and questions here. So we have a comment here from Ramin, who says, who says that our archivist, Sarah, found a record of a man who was blinded in a factory accident in Evergreen Cemetery. It speaks to the dangerous working conditions that many, if not all, of these factory workers would have been exposed to. And unfortunately, that is the case with this gentleman who was blinded. Sarah also comments here that the Wheelers ran the Saugatuck Manufacturing Company, yes, because they were locally known for making buttons. It was colloquially known as the button shop. Yes, very true. And that was the factory that is now on the site of, or was on the site of the dock shop down in Saugatuck. And we do have a response to Ramin's comment about the man who was blinded. William Davidson was a blacksmith, according to the 1880 census, for defective, dependent, and delinquent cases, as it was called then. His eyes were burned out by a casting iron. Very unfortunate. He was injured when he was 30 years old, but he went on to live a long life. He was married, actually widowed twice, and he married twice within a year, actually. He had 3 wives, but he lived to a very old age of 65. We do have a question here from Sheila, and she asks actually about the Wheelers of the Saugatuck Manufacturing Company. Is it the same Wheelers as the Bradley Wheeler House? And they are related, but not directly. They're actually cousins. It is notable that the Wheelers actually built several very, very fine houses down near the Saugatuck Manufacturing Company, but they ultimately were demolished when I-95 moved through the Saugatuck area. We actually have a really lovely picture that shows both the factory as well as those homes that were built on the hill just where 95 would be today. And Sarah also comments that Tokay, who made the carburetor, first started making boat motors and full boats. And that F.T. Bedford, who was a very wealthy man and went on to be a philanthropist here in Westport as well, bought a 20-foot yacht from the companies in the late 1890s. So if you have any other questions or comments about any of the other factories or manufacturing institutions here in Westport, please do enter them below. I'm always happy to answer those later on if you weren't able to join us live. Thank you so much for tuning in. I do hope that you enjoyed going through these items with me, and have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much.